what I'm going to talk to you about today is some work that I've been doing, trying to apply basically some modern machine learning methods to problems I've been working on for about 12 years now, which is how do we relate structural connectivity measures, DTI, to individual differences, specifically, in this case, broad personality constructs that you might see in social and personality psychology. So the way that we're doing this now is in my lab, which is brand new, and we're starting this year, and it's really exciting. I have all these great people working for me, and they do a lot of the heavy lifting. Specifically for this project, I've gotten a lot of help from my lab manager, Dale Tovar. So what is this? How do I kind of think about this stuff? Right, so let's say you're sitting around, you're under the age of 60, you want to watch something. You might turn on Netflix, right? Watch Stranger Things. To be able to do this effectively, to have a good stream of Netflix come to you, everybody's had an experience where it doesn't kind of come on right. You need a few things, right? A few things need to be in place. So first, Netflix themselves need to have a good working server, right? That's delivering that content to you. It's not broken, right? Makes sense. You also need to have a computer or a TV or whatever it is that you're using that is also not broken, right? That can handle streaming videos, all that stuff, right? In most cases, your ability to watch Stranger Things and to have a nice fluid experience of that is not due to Netflix servers or your laptop, right? What it's due to is you're at your grandma's house and she has some crappy Wi-Fi, or you're at the airport or anything, right? So this is much more what seems to influence your experience of watching Stranger Things on Netflix. Now, what about the brain, right? We're talking about the brain now. There's a similar analogy here, right? So in your brain, we have processing centers in our brain that are online with gray matter regions that are actually involved in the computational processes behind a lot of different kinds of stuff. So you can look at fMRI data, you can look at cortical thickness, all kinds of gray matter stuff is kind of the servers and the computers, right? But of course, the connections between these things often also really matter, right? Your experience to have your ability to experience psychological things requires all of these things in concert. But typically, as social and affective neuroscientists, we sort of ignore this part of the brain. So white matter actually accounts for about 50% of your total brain volume, right? And if you think about the disproportionate number of studies that are investigating white matter relative to gray matter, there's a lot of opportunity here. And this is exactly what we're doing. This is exactly the approach that we're taking. So what is diffusion? The way that we measure this is with diffusion MRI, sometimes called diffusion tensor imaging. That's a specific instantiation of this, but I won't get into the details too much. But essentially what diffusion imaging is getting at is that it's a structural neuroimaging technique. There's no tasks. It's measuring essentially a picture of your brain at any given time, right? What it's doing is it's using properties of the diffusion of water molecules along the length of your axons, measures of different kinds of white matter properties that we might be interested in. So what we can glean from these methods are indications of connectivity, what gray matter region is connected to what other gray matter region, and also properties of the white matter itself. How high is the fidelity? How myelinated are the axons? We can get some rough estimations of what these look like, right? And then what we can do is we can use these measures to relate them to anything that we want to. So we can use it to relate to behavioral data. We can use it to relate to other fMRI data, anything that we might have. They're just numbers, right? So one of the things that I've been interested in for a long time is how did these properties relate to personality data, right? So big five traits, other individual differences measures that are shown to be really robust in the literature. And specifically, one of the ideas that I've been playing around with for a while is how these individual differences measures are related to other things that we might care about too, like psychopathology, right? So one of the ideas in the literature is this spectrum hypothesis idea that essentially at the extreme end of any normal variability in some personality trait lies some psychopathology looking thing. So if you're really high on agreeableness, too high on agreeableness, you're just some lemming who gets manipulated too much. Too low, you're a psychopath, right? This is the idea. So at some tipping interval, it becomes a problem. And the assumption under here is that there's actually a common etiology that's supporting each of these things, right? So this is what we're sort of interested in. So is the one source of the common etiology that links personality to psychopathology, the brain, and in our case specifically, the white matter, right? So this is what we're doing using kind of standard off-the-shelf machine learning algorithms, at least as a first pass to this, right? So there's two classes of machine learning that you're probably familiar with in some degree or another. There's supervised learning techniques. These are the classification and regression techniques that we all know and love. And there's also the unsupervised learning techniques, which tend to be these clustering methods. And for DTI data, you can apply either of these to either of these classes to the DTI data, just like you could with your fMRI data or anything else you care about. So I'm mostly going to be talking about the supervised learning for now, but I'll hint at some stuff with the unsupervised later. So this is kind of the standard model that we would do in neuroimaging in general, but also in diffusion imaging. So what we would do is, if we're interested in how personality is reflected in the white matter, is we'd fit a model to each voxel in the brain, right? So we're trying to predict how much that voxel is related to extroversion. So we do that, then we'd slide it over, and we do it again, right? Have a new model. And then we'd keep doing that until we tiled the whole cortex with all these little models of extroversion, right? That's the way we've always done things. That's the way people did things in DTI for a long time. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? So indeed, you can take that whole equation and just completely flip it around and maybe gather some new insights into this. So rather than having this mass univariate approach that we all know and love, we flip it around and say, instead of trying to predict extroversion at each voxel, we use all the voxel information in concert to try and predict extroversion. And I think often this reflects more what psychologists want us to be doing. They don't care about what voxels is involved with extroversion. They want to know what the brain can do for them. So I think this is actually an approach that mirrors some of their desires. So how have we done this? So what we did for this particular set of subjects is that we took a portion of the NKI, the Nathan Klein Institute Rockland sample, which is this open data set. It's nationally representative with respect to socioeconomic status, sex, race, ethnicity. And we took a portion of that and we analyzed it through our DTI. In our sample of it, we only have part of it analyzed thus far, so stay tuned. But we had 324 subjects. We put 216 of them in our training set, and then we lopped off 108 of them for our testing set. So our testing set was never seen by, it's a completely out of sample prediction, nice and pure. And then what we did was we built a whole brain FA predictive model based on fractional anisotropy data. So this is a common technique for looking at white matter integrity. It's a little fuzzy of a measure, but bear with me. And then what we did was we submitted it to just a ridge regression, right? So simple ridge regression, we used the NL tools package, which has been developed by Luke Chang's lab. And we just, rather than deploying it on fMRI data like you typically see it, we just deployed on our diffusion data after some really careful ANTS registrations. And then we just fit that model with the leave one subject out cross-validation scheme, and then we use it, then we can use this information to then predict out a sample, right? So what we're looking at here are the big 5 personality traits, and then comparing it to some psychopathology variables, which I'll get to in a second. So what happens when you do this? So I had these big ideas, based on some of my previous work, that the 2 variables that would come out would be openness to experience and neuroticism. And of course, I was half right, which is actually pretty good for me. And neuroticism was actually the only one that kind of held up in the sample. So what this is here is a weight map of that ridge regression. What you can think of it as kind of like a brain-shaped regression equation, right? So where the hot values are, those are where the beta values were, positively informing the prediction of neuroticism. The blue values, the cold values are the negative ones. Most of it's white, right? So this is kind of the signature, if you will, of how neuroticism is expressed in the white matter, so to speak. So then the question is, okay, great, you have a model, this works in the training sample, how does it actually fit in the out-of-sample data? Well, here we go. So using the out-of-sample data, what we find is that we do find a significant relationship between our model fit and the prediction and the predictive values in this out-of-set data. So this is an R of about 0.23. It's significant, 5% of the variance. You might think, okay, this is pretty modest, and it is. But compare it to other things that we know about neuroticism. So when you have people's peer ratings of neuroticism, these are friends, right? And I rate you on a scale. The actual values, how much those correlate, are right in the range of what this model is saying, right? And it's way above strangers. So if I meet a stranger and I ask you how neurotic they are, the white matter knows better than they do, right? And it's also greater than other things that neuroticism has been linked to more broadly, like general mortality, right? So that's great. So although we're not accounting for a huge amount of the variance, we're accounting for some thing that seems to mirror other stuff that we might care about. One question might be, how is this related to other methods, the standard kind of univariate pipeline that we look at? So what we did here was in our out-of-sample data, this is in our testing data, the 108 subjects, we ran a standard univariate analysis on it. So using permutation tests, all the cluster info, everything that we're used to doing, nothing, right? So in that 108 subjects, if we were to run the univariate test and say, how is the white matter related to neuroticism, we would arrive at the conclusion that it's not. But using our predictive model, we found some evidence that it was. And indeed, when you compare the t-stat maps from the univariate analysis to the weight map from the multivariate analysis, they're just not related to one another. So they seem to be providing different kinds of information. Okay, great, Rob. So you found one of the big 5 traits that correlates with something. Who cares? So how can we apply this model to some other stuff that we might care about, specifically in these different kinds of psychopathology related variables of interest? So the 2 that we looked at were these general, from the adult self-report scale, these indicators of internalizing behavior. These are things that are related to depression, anxiety, and externalizing behavior, things that are relating to things like aggression, bullying, attentional problems, right? These are both correlated with neuroticism more broadly. But can we use our model based on neuroticism to predict these things in our out-of-sample data? And indeed, when you do this, for the internalizing behavior, it actually outperforms the neuroticism itself. So the correlation is a little bit higher in the internalizing behavior than it is for the neuroticism one. Externalizing, not so much, right? So it wasn't quite significant, didn't really work. But if you're squinting at this a little bit, you're like, well, Rob, yeah, sure. Significant, not significant. They kind of look the same. Maybe it's just a function of the internalizing disorders having a little bit higher of a correlation with the neuroticism in general, right? So we thought of that too. So this is how we're kind of looking at this now. So just to walk you through this plot a little bit, this is our out-of-sample correlation of neuroticism with all of these variables. So here's the internalizing total. We have some subscales from those, the other big 5, externalizing some subscales. And if it's the case that our out-of-sample prediction is just a function of the correlation between these measures, we should expect the white matter predictions to kind of hug this line a little bit. They should be related to one another. And indeed, when you look, they're not, right? So this dotted line is the alpha of 0.05. This is where things are significant. There's not really a relationship between the out-of-sample correlation and the prediction from the white matter. But what does cross the line a little bit, in general, are these internalizing disorder things, the subscales and the total score, and not so much the externalizing ones, and not really the other big 5, with the exception of agreeableness down here, which I don't know why. So this provides some specificity to these measures, right? So what does this mean? So at least for the relationship between internalizing disorders or related behaviors and neuroticism, we find evidence that at least in part, some of this is due. There's some mechanistic account of white matter contributing to this relationship, right? So externalizing disorders are also related to neuroticism, but at least from our analysis, we don't find any relationship with the white matter. And what this means is that, the relationship between these 2 variables probably has something to do with this. Maybe not all of it, right? There's other things going on. But these are also related, but it's not due to this. So we have a more specific account of the mechanistic relationship between these 2 things. And I think that contributes to our understanding of some of this stuff. So just really quickly, I'll end with this. That's our supervised learning portion. We're also doing some unsupervised learning stuff with some of these DTI metrics. So just to conclude, some general conclusions. Whole brain models of diffusion imaging data can predict personality traits in data that's never been seen before. And that's pretty exciting, cool, works out great. These models provide some different information than standard univariate methods. Now, I don't want to say they're better or worse, but they're certainly different, and they're different in our hands. And you might arrive at different conclusions about what DMRI, how it can inform your studies if you use one versus the other, right? And this also means to provide some increased specificity in linking certain kinds of brain mechanisms to underlying psychological constructs, and in this case, broad scale personality, individual differences variables. Great, thank you.